Now, the first concept here is to use what's called stencil alpha, which is just a blend mode available to you on layers. So I'm going to keep it simple here and just put a piece of text on the screen. Now, so this text is going to be revealed by another layer, and that layer is simply going to contain a rectangular shape. I'm going to leave it with a nice gaudy green fill so that you'll know it's there, and I'm going to draw that out there like that. I'm going to move it off to the side so you can just see it there on the left. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to animate this object across the screen, nice and slowly over 5 frames. Now it's going to have a weird kind of a motion path because the anchor point isn't centered in the shape. Try to ignore that. Okay, so it just animates across the text until it's covering the text. Now what I can do is I can set the blend mode of the shape layer to what's called stencil alpha. And first thing that you'll notice is that the text disappears. The text disappears because when you set the shape layer to stencil alpha, it acts much like a mask in that it will only show the objects within that shape in the layers directly beneath it. So the shape is on the top layer, the reveal text is on the bottom. Because the shape is set to stencil alpha, it's a blend mode. That means that it will only show the layers beneath it within that shape. And you'll also see that the shape disappears. It turns from a visual object into a masking object or a utility object that's being used to do something else. Now there are stencil alpha and there's silhouette alpha, and silhouette is the opposite, so it'll invert the effect. Now it will only show what's outside of that shape. Change that back to stencil alpha. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. So instead of using a mask that we draw, now we can use an object, and this object can be anything that has opacity and transparency. So the alpha here refers to the fact that everything inside in this shape is opaque or visible. Everything outside is invisible. There is nothing around this shape, so it has different alpha values, and it's using the difference in alpha values to say which or what parts of the text layer beneath it are made visible. Okay, so that's the first concept, and that's the use of stencil alpha. Now I'm going to come back to that in a moment. I'm going to create another composition now, and I'm going to call this painting. Not painting. Painting. And click OK. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to the paintbrush tool. I'm not going to be doing any painting in a visible sense with this. I will initially, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the painting tool or the brush tool as a means of creating an object that I can use as a mask, much like I did with that rectangle a second ago. Now, the paint tool is used differently to things like the text tool and the shape tools, in that it has to be applied to a layer. Okay, so if I had imported an object, or yes, an object such as a piece of video, so if I just use this, and if I was to drag that down onto my layers and open it up as a layer, I would be able to get my paintbrush and paint on that. If I go back out into my composition, you'll see it there on the layer, but if I get my paintbrush tool and try and draw, it won't allow me to. So it won't do it out in the composition, it will only do it in the layer panel. So it will only do it on a particular layer. So if you wanted to paint, but you didn't want to be painting on a particular layer, if you just wanted to create a brush stroke, then what you would do is you would create what's called a solid. And it's much like a null object in that it's gotten through control clicking, going new solid, and it gives you a kind of a utility that you can use. So it'll just give you a dark grey by default. If you change the colour to red, then it'll change the name, or it'll actually name after whatever colour you've selected. Now the colour isn't really important, so I click OK. Actually no, I'll change the colour to back to grey. Click OK, and that opens up. Okay, so now that is on my composition window. If I double click on it, it will open up that solid in a layer of its own. Okay, so the first thing I can do is I can draw on this. I can draw with the paintbrush. Now before I do, I can go into my brushes, I can change the diameter, I can change the hardness to affect the actual size and shape of the brush. So now I can do a bit of drawing if I want to. Okay, so that's pretty simple. So I'm just drawing on my grey solid. Now when I've painted, the paintbrush itself is represented in my effects drop down in my layer. So when I open the effects drop down here, I now have paint, and that paint has its own set of parameters and things that I can change. Now the first thing that I can change here is whether it's paint on transparent. Now if it's set to off, then it's going to paint on that layer. I'm going to be able to see the layer and the paintbrush that I've added to it. But the real power of this paintbrush, as we're going to use it, is the ability to turn that on and change it from drawing onto a solid grey object to the equivalent of drawing on a plastic acetate. So now I can go back out into my composition, into this one, and you'll see now that the layer that contains the paintbrush is now over my composition. So I could create some text here now, for example, just to illustrate that the grey solid has disappeared. So I'll pull that text down underneath. Okay, so I get the paintbrush. I need to do the paintbrush on a grey solid, but I can switch off that layer and turn it from drawing onto an opaque object such as my grey solid or my video or a JPEG or whatever you're doing, to actually doing the equivalent of drawing on transparent plastic. Okay, so that's the first thing, that I can create a brush stroke and then knock out the layer that it's being drawn onto. Now the next thing is visualizing or seeing where those brush strokes appear in the layers. So every brush stroke that you draw shows up as a brush stroke here in the layers as well. So I've got brush 1 and brush 2. If I keep drawing, I'll just keep getting extra brush strokes. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the paint for the moment. I'll keep my dark solid. Now I'm going to paint, but I'm going to paint in a particular mode this time. I'm going to paint in what's called right on mode. Now what right on is going to allow me to do is it's going to allow me to draw, and it's going to record that drawing in real time and then allow me to play it back along the timeline. And the way that you do that is you just get your solid, open it up so that you're looking at the layer view and not the composition view, and set the duration down here in the paint to right on. Now when I paint, and I open up that paint, you'll see that brush 1 is a clip and it has keyframes in the stroke options. So if I, first of all, actually, first thing to look out for is that it hasn't actually disappeared. It's just gone to the first keyframe of your animated brush stroke. Now, so far so straightforward. Okay, we were able to draw, and if we deselect that brush stroke by just clicking off it and then going back in and drawing another one, depending on where the playhead is, we can start another brush stroke. And it will look to where the playhead is, it will start a keyframed animation following the brush strokes. So the first one goes, then the second one joins it. So you can draw in real time and it will actually record your drawing. Again, if I want to now, I can go to Paint on Transparent, switch it to On, and go back out into my composition. So now I've got some animated brush strokes drawing onto the composition. Now, just to finish the idea of using the paint strokes to reveal the text, I'm going to bring those two ideas together. I'm going to bring the brush strokes and the stencil alpha together, and to do that what I'm going to do is I'm going to first of all open up my layer. I'm going to increase the size of the brush considerably to go to 200, or roughly 200. Actually, I'll go a bit higher. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the playhead back to the start, and I'm going to do a nice slow paint stroke across the middle. Play that back. Okay, now I'm in my layer view, which is where I need to be to draw my brush stroke. So I'm going to go back to composition, and I've missed the text slightly, but I won't worry too much about that. I'll just move the whole thing down. Now because I have this paint set to Paint on Transparent, I've knocked out the grey from the grey solid. Now my paint stroke paints right across the top of my text. If I now set my dark grey solid layer to stencil alpha, it will reveal the text through the use of that brush stroke.